demands, and I'm hopeful that ultimately they will make a criminal contempt referral to the extent that individuals like Mr. Bannon and others refuse to comply with these subpoenas. Ultimately, that'll be something that the full House has to vote on and then refer back to the Department of Justice. And I'm hopeful that the Attorney General Garland, who I know believes in the rule of law and the separation of powers, would take that referral seriously.
I mean, it's just kind of ridiculous that people think subpoenas are optional. I want you to take a listen to your colleague, Congressman Jamie Raskin, on his thoughts on how to enforce these subpoenas.
That is turning the information over to the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia and trying to get the Department of Justice to demand that these people appear in court and be jailed until the point at which they cooperate with the congressional subpoena. It could be civil contempt, or it also could be inherent contempt of Congress, where we design our own process for hauling these people in and perhaps fining them until they're willing to cooperate.
Is that a good strategy?
Yeah, look, I agree with my colleague and my good friend, Mr. Raskin. I think that he is right. It's really sort of a binary choice for the Congress, right? It's either pursuing the criminal contempt referral that I referenced and that Jamie referenced, or it's using the inherent contempt powers of the Congress, which are implied under the Constitution. There are several of us, including Jamie, myself, Ted Lieu, Val Demings on the House Judiciary Committee, who have proposed doing precisely that. And, Tiffany, you'll recall this was really born from our bearing witness to the total and complete obstruction, the wholesale obstruction by the Trump administration during 2019 and 2020 and a variety of different congressional investigations that the Congress was engaged in at that time. The reality is that Congress has long had inherent contempt powers. It has not used them for the better part of the last 90 years, really since the Teapot Dome scandal of the 1920s. But I think it's an important step forward and something that the Congress ought to consider, and it's why we've introduced a resolution to do precisely that, to essentially codify some procedures around the utilization of inherent contempt so that congressional subpoenas can be lawfully enforced.
I mean, it just feels like, Congressman, it's time for the January 6th committee and Congress as a whole, really, to say, put some respect on our name. We are a co-equal branch of government, and we haven't really seen that play out. A few bad actors is one thing. What concerns me is the followers, the fact that nearly 75 million people knew full well who this man was and still cast a ballot for him. I want you to take a listen to some of the folks who attended his rally and understand that these folks' votes are valued just as much as ours, in some cases more with gerrymandering. Take a listen.
You can't even try to convince me that the election was in any way fair, that there were any election laws that were truly being followed.
We're out here, obviously, to support the real winner of the last election.
Did you say that jokingly, or you say that
seriously? Seriously.
We're not going to take it anymore. I see a civil war coming. I do. I see civil war coming, especially with his mandates.
Yeah, a civil war is here. And for all the people who say, oh, this is older white people who feel this way, I saw some very young-looking kids there repeating the same ridiculous, asinine rhetoric that is really against our democracy. What are we to do if this is how a good chunk of the country feels? Will they ever accept another election outcome?
Well, look, Tiffany, I think it underscores the reality of disinformation and misinformation and the way in which that is permeating the general public psyche and has for the last year and a half, 2 years, 3 years. Look, I was in the Capitol on January 6th, as you know. I think the threats that existed on that day have metastasized since then. They have not gone away. They're underneath the surface. And it's all the more reason why the Select Committee on January 6th, that committee's work is so important in terms of getting to the truth as to what happened that day and ultimately making some recommendations to the Congress as to safeguards that we can put into place over the course of the next year and a half to ensure that something like that never happens again. One thing that we're working on right now, just by way of background, is reforms to the Electoral Count Act, which, as you know, was a law that came into play during the course of the 2020 presidential election, and clearly a law that needs to be reformed in light of the developments that we've learned of with respect to Mr. Eastman, the president's lawyer, and the conversations with Vice President Mike Pence in the days leading up to the certification of the 2020 election. So look, I've said it before, I've said it again. Our republic is at stake. It is important for all of us to take this very seriously.
Take it very seriously and also take action, because we're coming up on midterms, Congressman, as you well know. Should Democrats lose the House or lose the Senate, I'm willing to bet not only does the January 6th committee die, but perhaps the filibuster dies as well. And then it's, a free fall for our democracy.
We should have done a long time ago,
what's your
and that is
message
support
to
housing
voters as
in
we
a
go
real
into
and significant
midterms?
way.
Well, my message is simple, that the 2020 election could very well be one of the most consequential elections in the modern history of our country, and that it is very, very important for folks to turn out and to get out the vote and to ensure that we elect candidates who care about the rule of law, who care about maintaining our country as the constitutional republic. And I think that, as you said at the very outset of the program, democracy really is at stake.
And just really quickly before I let you go, I've been asking members of Congress who I've had the privilege of sharing the screen with this question, how is it working on the Hill? Because you have to run into folks who sound like those rally-goers. You have to work alongside Congresswoman MTG, Congressman Andy Biggs, Paul Gosar, all these folks who say these same crazy things. You cite misinformation, which is certainly true. I'm going to say it more plainly and say this is white supremacy run amok, as it always has been in this country. How is it seeing those folks in the hallway?
Well, look, I don't come across those members that you mentioned in my time, at least in Congress. Look, at the end of the day, I would say it is a vitriolic and toxic atmosphere right now. And I think, again, it's in large part because of those threats that existed on January 6th that have metastasized since then. That has not abated at all. If anything, it has only gotten worse.
Well, given their resistance to mask wearing, I say keep your distance. So thank you so much, Congressman Joe Neguse. We'll have to have you back very soon. And coming up,
we need to stay together and bound by the values that we hold as a party. Because here's the deal. We won 2020 as a unified party. And we're looked to 2022. As we do that, we need to stay unified.
All right, so after the rising majority came out in droves to deliver the power of the federal government to Democrats,
a long time
there
ago,
may not be a lot to show for it when it comes to policy
in a real
coming out
and significant
of Congress.
way.
But we should remember what this country could have looked like under 4 more years of Trump. And keep in mind, should Republicans regain control of Congress, expect policy that will have a mostly adverse effect on the country. The January 6th Commission would likely die right along with the filibuster, and then it's pretty much a free fall for this democracy. So will President Biden's message about unity remain the message to voters as we go into midterms? Let's find out. Joining me now to discuss is Chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Jamie Harrison. Jamie, I'm so happy to have you on the show with me this morning. It's lovely to share a screen with you. We haven't done this in a while. So thanks for joining me this morning.
I know it's so good to see you, and thank you for what you do each and every day. I watch every weekend, so keep pushing.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I have to tell you, Jamie, I'm very concerned because there's a lot of attacks on our democracy right now. Gerrymandering, voting rights, these quite privileged, crazy people who are trying to overthrow democracy. Donald Trump still driving the Republican Party in many ways. Given all of this, can Democrats hold Congress and the power of the federal government? And what's the plan to make sure that they do?
Well, Tiffany, we have to hold Congress because we know what's on the other side. As I often tell my Democrats, and I told them yesterday at our fall meeting, we are the wall between hope and chaos. We see what's happening on the other side. We see what will happen if Kevin McCarthy is given the gavel in the House of Representatives, if Mitch McConnell is able to get back as majority leader. We know what's going to happen.
We should have done a long time ago, and that is support housing in a real and significant way.
All of that will end. I can tell you that. I can guarantee you that. And so we have to stay in charge of the houses of Congress in order to protect our democracy, because these people don't care about protecting it. They only care about power. Now, what we are doing, and my grandma always told me, Jamie, control what you can control. I wish I had a vote in the U.S. Senate, but I don't. So what can I control? That's what we're doing at the DNC. We have doubled down to make sure in this historic moment we are taking historic action. I have committed almost $70-some million to make sure that we're doing voter protection. We're putting boots on the ground right now in terms of organizing in communities of color. For the first time in 30 years, Tiffany, the DNC is getting involved in registration. I just announced a $5 million plan to register more people of color across our battleground states. We are putting communications staff in beds on the ground so that they can get the message out to the people. So we are $23 million into our state parties, going back to the 57 state and territory strategy of Governor Dean. So we're doing all that we can right now to really, really strengthen the Democratic operations going into 2022.
Okay, well, let's talk messaging, because I have to say something that has always frustrated me when Democrats get out there on the stomping ground and they talk about, hey, I can win these mysterious swing voters that nobody knows who they are. I can speak to these Trump voters. I can win red states. It's exhausting. Hey, talk to the folks who brought you here. Talk about how you can win your base vote. And we haven't seen, a lot of that traditionally. Have we finally gotten away from that messaging in the political landscape?
Well, that's what we're doing at the DNC right now. We
are doubling down on the base support housing
of the Democratic
in a real
Party.
and significant
way. We have
way.
made an even larger constituency outreach program where we're on the ground right now doing things to work with these communities. Because you can't just drop in 2 or 3 months before an election and say, hey, y'all, we need you to come out and vote again. That's not good enough. We have to be more than a political organization, Tiffany. We got to be a community organization. That means we're working on the ground to help address the everyday needs of the American people, and particularly the base of our party. And that's what we're working on right now at the DNC, and making sure that we strengthen our state party operations to do just that.
All right, so I want to get into some of these races specifically because I hear a lot about Cinema Mansion. I want to hear a lot more about Warnock. He is up in 2022. Just to explain to our viewers why he's up. He was elected to fill, it was a special election. He was filling the remainder of a term. And look, if the Democrats lose Warnock in the Senate, then the Democrats will lose the power of the Senate. What are Warnock's chances of holding on to his seat in Georgia?
I think Reverend Warnock's chances are really, really good. And listen, Reverend Warnock is probably one of the best political folks that I've seen out on the stump. He can connect with people, and not just black folks, but everybody, because of who he is and his life story. He and John Ossoff were able to do something that many folks thought could not be done. And they were able to do it in a convincing fashion. He's going to be able to pull together that coalition. And listen, if Reverend Warnock and Stacey Abrams is on the ballot in Georgia, and I hope Stacey decides to run for Georgia.
What we should have done a long time ago, and that is support housing
Superman
in a real and significant way.
All on the same field, pushing out that vote. So I'm very excited about Warnock.
I have to say, keep your eye on Lex Luthor, because Brian Kemp down there is definitely far ahead on the voter suppression game. Look, you and I are both children from the South, so I want to get into some of the messaging around Democratic talk as well. Another challenge I've always had, there have always been these cute little nicknames for white voters, soccer moms, NASCAR dads, etc. And I never hear any of these names that reflect people who look like me. And I think that's part of the challenge, right, when Democrats are going out to tell a story. You look at President Biden's ratings, they're the lowest that they've been. I mean, we're talking like Trump numbers. You have to remind people, hey, remember what we just left and remember what we could have. So when it comes to telling a story, how will the Democratic Party speak to the rising majority? Black folks, brown folks, AAPI folks, Native American folks?
Well, we have to talk about how these policies have impacted them. I mean, just take a look at the child tax credit, Tiffany. I grew up as a poor kid, a single mom, grandparents. I was on welfare and food stamps. And I think about this $300 tax credit that families are getting right now. School just started back about a month or so ago in many places. And I can tell you, there are many families struggling to make ends meet, to get the school supplies and all. But it was that $300 tax credit that was able to give them a little relief. And we have to continue that on. But what we as Democrats have to remind people is that only happened because people voted in November, and they voted again in January in Georgia, and they elected Democrats in the House, the Senate, and the White House. That's why they got those benefits. And the only way those benefits will continue is if Democrats are left in office, because not one Republican voted
a long time ago.
And that is having a real-world impact on the
in a real
bottom
and
line
significant
for many
way.
of these families. We look at some of the HBCUs and some of the funding that was given through the American Rescue Plan to the historically black colleges that kept many of them open during this pandemic. That only happened because all Democrats voted for it in the House and the Senate and the White House. And so we just got to tell the story of how we have delivered for the American people and how we're still working to deliver for them.
Yeah, and meet the voters where they are. Not everybody
Amen.
is tuning into, certain shows. So anyway, thank you so much, Jamie Harrison. We'll have to finish this conversation on a Saturday weekend. But thanks for joining me here on Sunday while my colleague Kay Part is out. Thank you, Jamie Harrison. All right, how years of systemic racism, gentrification, and now the pandemic are endangering historic...
That the Council of the City of San Jose apologizes to all Chinese immigrants and their descendants who came to San Jose and were victims of systemic and institutional racism, xenophobia, and discrimination.
It was more than 100 years too late, but San Jose, California officially apologized recently for decades of systemic racism against Chinese communities, including an arson attack in 1887 that wiped out a thriving Chinatown neighborhood. More than 1,000 people were displaced, and it was not an isolated incident. Racists often use fire as a weapon against Chinese communities along the West Coast. And this new reckoning comes as America's Asian communities grapple with new threats, from a rise in hate crimes to concerns about gentrification. Joining me now, Yvonne Kwan. She's a professor of Asian American Studies at San Jose University. I'm so happy to have you with me this morning and to be talking about something that, quite frankly, deserves a lot more attention. I'm curious, Dr. Kwan, how is it received when the city like San Jose 100 years later issues this apology?
I think it's very important in terms of the Chinese American communities here. It's a celebration. It's definitely this reckoning that we're having across the board, but in particular in a quite liberal and progressive place like San Jose, in which we often, conflate more with tech and the booming kind of different kinds of businesses and growth here. We kind of forget that history. And as my colleague, Connie Young Yu, who's also a descendant of the Second Street Market Chinatown that was burned down due to arson, her grandfather was actually a resident there. What she was saying is that there were actual people there, right? Because we often think about just numbers of, how many people were there, but there were living, thriving communities there. And this is one step to recognize how that arson, how that nativism, xenophobia continued to impact the later generations, but also how people pushed back and fought for this recognition as well.
And you said continued, but still continues, quite frankly. And I think this is why, critical race theory is something that's important. There are plenty of conversations. We need to have intellectual curiosity about our fellow countrymen. Some people don't always know what the API community has gone through in this country. I remind people this country has not been too kind to any community of color, quite frankly. When you don't know a community, it becomes easier to dehumanize that community. I'm curious if you could talk to us about what we don't learn in schools and how that impacts the treatment of some in the API
in a
community
real and
today.
Significant way.
Absolutely. So, for example, someone like me, I am a professor of ethnic studies, right? So one thing that I think folks need to be clear about is that ethnic studies is not just studying about content or people, but really, as you said, grounding it in critical race theory, intersectional critical race and ethnic studies analysis. So we need to revitalize these histories that have been hidden in the history books. And much of K through 12 education, we don't hear about the experiences of Chinese Americans or other Asian Pacific Islander Americans. And it's really a shame because we can learn so much from this in terms of the contemporary context, as you mentioned about the rise in anti-Asian violence, hate crimes, and the such. So usually in our K through 12 classes, we might hear about, the gold rush, the 49ers. The Chinese were there and they helped build the railroads, and then move on, right? Or, for example, you learn a little bit about Japanese internment, Japanese incarceration, and also the Vietnam War. But you don't really hear about the individual experiences, the struggles people encountered through that. And it's so important because we have to use those histories to contextualize also relations with other BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, right? Because all the folks are subjected to similar histories, similar experiences. And instead of dividing people, which is a tactic that is often used in this country, right? Divide and conquer. I would love to see how these histories are intertwined,
we should have done a long time ago,
struggles are
and
intertwined,
that is
and how we can fight together
in a real and
as
significant
co-conspirators
way.
and allies to push against racism, xenophobia, and all of those manifestations in the contemporary context, and recognizing how the past continues to shape the present.
There's strength in numbers, to your point. Something that I noticed living here in Washington, D.C., a lot of major cities have Chinatowns. And, you know, they're beautiful aesthetically, and, you know, they look like, you know, Chinatowns. However, I wonder how many people to this day in the community, in the Chinese community, are benefiting from these Chinatowns, as gentrification is also an issue sweeping the country.
Yeah, so I was actually born in Los Angeles, Chinatown, and for a long time, my dad worked as a waiter there. I had family who had businesses there. I worked in the Los Angeles Chinatowns, and my mother actually worked in a sweatshop in Chinatown, but in New York City. So I have had my kind of personal connections with Chinatown, and I have family members still there as well. But because in New York City, rent control, other than that, they would not be able to afford to live there, right? But also those who are elderly, I think, are benefiting from living in places like Chinatown, because many do not or may not have had the ability or the exposure to develop the English language. And, you know, not because of people's unwillingness to do so, but because of migration age, the need to work in these ethnic labor and the such. But for the elderly folk, because the rent is so low, many of the landlords are not. Yeah, but they want them out. They're not fixing their apartments. They're not doing any maintenance on these things. And also a lot of the businesses are moving out because the rent is so expensive.
It's shooting up, exactly. I think that's a displacement that a lot of people don't know about. And Chinatowns are, quite frankly, safe havens for immigrants and working class communities that are, you know, being priced out. We're running out of time, so I just want to really quickly play a soundbite for you from Senator Chuck Grassley, who made, you know, an ignorant comment this week, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
What you said about your Korean background reminds me a lot of what my daughter-in-law of 45 years has said. If I learned anything from Korean people, it's a hard work ethic and how you can make a lot out of nothing. So I congratulate you and your people.
First of all, that was ridiculous. But secondly, this model minority myth is not a compliment.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely not. And also, it is rooted in anti-Blackness. That's the thing. Absolutely. The model minority myth came out of post-World War II civil rights movement as a way to punish, to discipline Black folks, right, who are trying to fight for their rights. They're like, oh, why don't you look at the Japanese Americans? They went through incarceration, and yet look at how successful and wonderful they are, right? So it's this really backhanded compliment that just creates this stereotype in which it invisibilizes and hides the struggles and challenges within Asian American communities. It's not to not recognize the successes and all of that, right? Because we need to do that. We need to celebrate the greatness within our communities, but also our communities are immensely complex and diverse. So touting these model minority myths is so damaging.
It is very damaging, and we also need to disaggregate when we talk
about
the API community. So we have way too much to talk about, Yvonne Kwan. You'll just have to come back when we have more time. So thank you so much for joining us, and you don't want to go anywhere at home, because coming up, our all-star panel joins me to sound off to the other Sunday shows. So